Welcome and thanks for coming out with us this afternoon. I am Mark Marshall. I'm the president and CEO of Rocky Mountain Communities. We're an affordable housing owner, manager, developer. We, in partnership with the Urban Land Conservancy, our president and CEO, Aaron Mirapole in the back, are being able to bring in Gregg today after each of us had a chance to hear him speak at Aaron being on a panel with Gregg last fall and me hearing Gregg in a presentation. Just knowing the crisis that we're going through here in Denver and in Colorado, his message really resonated with us, and thought that he should be here. But before I bring Gregg up and do the introduction, I want to bring up Andy Proctor. Andy Proctor is here, and he'll do his own introduction here from Metro State. So.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Andy Proctor. I'm director of the Affordable Housing Institute at MSU Denver. And really, I am not going to spend any time telling you about the Institute because I'm going to leave you hanging until the end. You have to stay to the end to get that detail. I just want to thank you all for coming on behalf of MSU Denver. And back to you, Mark.
All right. Thank you, Andy. We will have a moderator during the question and answering period here. The moderator will be Jonathan Capelli. Jonathan's the executive director of NDC Neighborhood Development Collaborative, which is a group of about 28 affordable housing owners, managers, developers, or practitioners in the Metro Denver area that really focus a lot on the policies and the programs that we need to create affordable housing, create and preserve. For my introduction right now, I'd like to bring up Gregg Colburn. Gregg is my phone closed off on me, so I'm just going to go from memory. Gregg. Gregg's an associate professor in the real estate department at the University of Washington's College of the Built Environment. He's also got a MSW, attended Kellogg School of Business here for his master's degree, and has done extensive work and research in the area of housing and affordability and some of these issues. You'll hear from Gregg here more about this work that he's delved into, but I had a chance to hear Gregg, and once again, it really resonated with me for the work that we're doing with the lack of affordable housing and the challenges that we've had in creating more here in Denver and in Colorado. So with that, I would like to bring up Gregg Colburn, our author.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Gregg.
Appreciate it. Thanks to Metro State for hosting me and us. Wow, look at this, is very fancy. You should see my classrooms at UW. It's not like this, I can tell you. It's usually like, will the projector work today? So anyway, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to spend about a half hour kind of going over the main arguments of our book, motivation for the book, and kind of what we found, and then I look forward to sharing Q&A with Jonathan and with the rest of you. So I'm a somewhat odd academic, and then I always joke like that's not sufficiently specific because there are plenty of odd academics, but I had a first career in finance. I was an investment banker and private equity investor for about 17 years, and then I quit and went and got my PhD in public policy and focused on housing during my PhD studies. And I study housing because I just think it's fundamental. These other social outcomes that we care a lot about, education, employment, healthcare, et cetera, are all dependent on housing. Without housing, we compromise those outcomes and undermine those outcomes. And housing, housing was kind of I started my PhD program in 2012. It was kind of a niche field in social policy. There was a lot more people studying poverty, for example, than housing. And I just felt like there was a need there. And I'd done some nonprofit work when I was in the private sector around housing and was excited about it. So that's how I ended up doing this. Do I have a clicker? I can't remember. Is this it? So I moved to Seattle with my family in 2017. We have a massive housing and homelessness crisis, which you're probably aware of. And My motivation for writing the book was just an observation that we didn't really know what was going on in Seattle. We agreed there was a big problem, but there was all these competing arguments about what was driving the crisis. And as a result, we just had a lot of competing narratives that basically led to public distrust of our collective ability to solve this. And that really concerned me as someone who's interested in public policy. Just my social circles, like, we're spending all this money, the problem's getting worse, why? Let's just quit, let's just stop doing this. And to me, that was the wrong diagnosis. And so the point of this book was really to translate what has been in the academic literature for some time for a general audience. So we have our own research, and we it's novel to a certain extent. The novelty is more in terms of the presentation of the information, as opposed to necessarily that we hadn't thought about this. We have about 20 years of literature kind of thinking about the differences between causes of homelessness at the community level versus the individual level. The individual level causes get a lot more attention, and the community level ones, which were largely done by economists, got less attention. So that's kind of the motivation. That's the book. And so I have been honored to travel all around the country and the world to talk about this issue. I was kind of expecting to be in high-cost jurisdictions talking about the book, San Francisco, Seattle, et cetera. And now I've been to places like Wichita, Kansas, and Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Green Bay, Wisconsin. And so this housing crisis is just creeping up all over the country, which is really concerning. The only good thing is if you wrote the book. Other than that, it's really bad, okay? And so I wish that I weren't getting these calls, because then that would mean that we weren't worried about this issue. All right, so we're at an academic institution, and so I think it's great to have an opportunity to kind of talk about causality, right? And so for those of you who have studied in the social sciences, we have all these courses on causal inquiry, and they're hard courses. Why? Because human beings are complex, and understanding causation in the human world is difficult. And so if you ask a good question, which is what causes homelessness, the proper answer to that question is, it's complicated, right? There's not one cause. And so there's also different ways of knowing. One of the ways of knowing is we ask people who are experiencing homelessness, why are you homeless? And that's a really important way of knowing, because we obviously need to honor the experience of people who have had, or who are going through this or have had that experience. I haven't. I've never been precariously housed. When we ask people, why are you homeless, we get all sorts of answers. And they're very blunt. My boyfriend beat me up and I ran. Now I'm homeless. I made some poor decisions. I drink too much. I got in a fight with my roommate, lost my job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to honor those explanations, because that's the truth. Okay? When we look at homelessness from a community level, the causes are very different. And so I knew that in this book that I wanted to kind of bring these two different explanations together. And the challenge with that is here's Gregg, a former investment banker wearing a blue blazer, saying it's the housing market, and there's a woman standing next to me saying it's domestic violence. Well, who am I to say that that's not her truth? So what we try to do is honor both these explanations, that both the individual circumstance and the structural explanation matter, and when they come together, they produce this issue. So the way that we do it in the book is to draw a distinction between root causes and precipitating events. We don't put these in competition with one another. We talk about the integration of these two. Okay? And so it's not that one is right and one is wrong. They're both true. And the way that we do that in the book is we use this metaphor of musical chairs, which social scientists have used for a long time to explain different phenomena. We put a little slightly different wrinkle on this. You know how the game works, 10 friends, 10 chairs. Leader starts the music, pulls one chair out. We got 10 chairs. We have 9 chairs and 10 people. Music stops, everyone scrambles, someone loses. In this case, it's Mike. Mike was on crutches after spraining his ankle. If we interviewed Mike after the game as social scientists and say, Mike, why'd you lose the game? What would he say? I had a bad ankle. And everyone would agree that that was the cause of Mike's chairlessness. But if we ask a different question and say, why didn't Mike have a chair? Because we didn't have 10 chairs. Had we had 10 chairs, Mike would have found a chair. It might have taken longer, it might not have been pretty, but he would have hobbled his way over and found a chair. Okay? This is exactly what's going on in Seattle and San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York and Boston and DC every day, which is when housing is scarce, it's expensive, and it's not available, people who are vulnerable are going to lose. Okay? In Seattle, I describe finding housing like it's like playing musical chairs with Usain Bolt, if anyone remembers who Usain Bolt is. right? Fastest man in the world, at least he used to be, Jamaican sprinter. He's going to win every time. The Amazon people are going to win the game every single time. And then when we walk down 3rd Avenue and we see Joe on the street, and we say, well, of course Joe's homeless, he's addicted. Of course Mike didn't have a chair, he's got a bad ankle. We're missing the structural deficit of housing that creates the conditions for this to happen. And then the Seattle Times spends all this time and energy talking about these individual vulnerabilities, which shapes our common understanding of homelessness, yet we're missing this really important thing right in front of us. Okay, so that's kind of the idea. This does not mean that poverty and drug use and mental illness don't matter. Of course they do. If you have any of those conditions, you're more likely to experience homelessness. Absolute causal relationship there. Okay? But there are people with those conditions and experiences in every jurisdiction in the United States. So that should cause us to kind of scratch our head a little bit and say, well, then what's going on? Why do some places have so much homelessness? So the motivating question for the book is a pretty simple one, which is, why does my home city of Seattle have 5 times the homelessness of my former city, Chicago? Massive variation. Okay? And the reason why we ask that question is if we can provide a credible explanation or a credible response to that question, it should tell us something fundamental about the nature of the problem and allow us as civic leaders, elected leaders, to focus our time and attention in that direction, as opposed to just playing whack-a-mole with all these different explanations, which is basically what we're doing right now. And a common explanation for regional variation is if poverty and drugs and mental illness cause homelessness at the individual level, if you have more people with those conditions, you'll have more homelessness. Right? That would get an A in a logic class. Turns out it's false. That hasn't stopped a lot of people from making that argument. So what's our thesis? Our thesis is that tight housing markets accentuate vulnerabilities and produce homelessness at high levels. That's why homelessness is more prevalent in our really expensive coastal cities. And these individual vulnerabilities that get all sorts of time and attention and hand-wringing are really a sorting mechanism. They're identifying the people who are going to lose housing when housing's scarce. I don't know one person who works at Amazon who's homeless. Right? Okay, so since we're going to talk about rates of variation, if that's what I'm trying to explain in the book, I want to demonstrate for you that, in fact, we have high rates of variation. Denver is excluded from the book, not because I dislike Denver. It's because you have a very interesting structure of your COC, which is the continuum of care, which is how you count homelessness. You have a bunch of counties included in your COC, which makes analysis a little more difficult. You do break it down, which is the box that I have, or the text that I have up there, but that's why you weren't in the book. I was not trying to discriminate against your lovely city. One of the challenges with counting homelessness is some places count at the city level, like New York City, and other places like King County, Seattle count at the county level. Neither way is right or wrong, but you can't compare those two because counties will have lower per capita rates of homelessness, all else equal, because you're including suburban locations. Homelessness congregates in the urban core. So when journalists write about comparing New York City to Seattle rates of homelessness, I'm always like, no, please don't do that. Okay? We need to compare cities to cities. When we do, our samples are like the 30 largest metro areas in the United States, with the exception of places like Denver that have a funky jurisdictional boundary. New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston are about 10 per capita in 2019 per 1,000, and that's about 5 times Indianapolis. Okay? This is a huge variation. Right? So we're trying to explain that variation in this book. When you go to counties, the numbers are lower for obvious reasons. But again, what you'll see is there's a 5-to-1 relationship between LA, Santa Clara, King, which is Seattle, Multnomah, which is Portland, is about 5 times Hillsborough, which is Tampa. Okay? So the logic of the book is we use very simple statistics, and we try to explain this variation. If an explanation doesn't provide sufficient response, we exit out and move to the next one. And then we just make our way through the book. And spoiler alert, housing plays an important role in this. All right, so we're going to start with individual explanations. These are very prevalent and important. And we start with poverty because fundamentally, homelessness, of course, homelessness is a poverty problem. If you're poor, if you have insufficient financial resources, you're far more likely to be homeless. No doubt about it. Okay? But what's interesting is when you plot rates of poverty, this is the percentage of people below the federal poverty line in a city or a county. This is per capita rates of homelessness. what you'll see is there's actually a modest statistical relationship between poverty and homelessness, but it's in the opposite direction of what you would think. Places with really high poverty, think Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis, have far lower rates of homelessness than the wealthiest cities in the United States, Seattle and San Francisco. Okay? So this is a head scratcher because I just told you that poverty causes homelessness. It does at the individual level. At the community level, homelessness thrives amidst affluence. This doesn't mean that poverty isn't important. Of course, poverty is an incredible social concern. The point of this slide is that being poor in a rich city has different consequences. The reason Seattle has a lot of homelessness is not that we have more poor people. Of course we have some poor people, but on a percentage basis, we have fewer poor people than a lot of places in the United States. Poverty rate in Detroit was up almost 40% after the Great Recession. Massive poverty, but far lower rates of homelessness than Seattle. Okay? So we can't blame disproportionality in rates of homelessness on poverty rates in a community. Okay? Now we're going to go into mental illness and substance use disorders. And the data for drug use and mental illness come from the federal government, and it's better at the state level than the city level. So this is every state in the nation plotted against homelessness and rates of serious mental illness. And what you can see if you've taken Stats 101 is there's no relationship here. It's just dots on a page. So the problem in California or Oregon or Washington is not that we have more people on a per capita basis who have serious mental illness. Of course we have some, as does Colorado, as does Mississippi, as does Tennessee. Okay? The point here is that the consequences of mental illness are different in different places. And we would argue it's because of the housing market. Of course, it's true that our response to mental illness in the United States has been insufficient, woefully insufficient. This doesn't mean that we don't need treatment. Of course we do. Okay? But if we're only focusing on drugs and mental illness, we're missing another key driver of this crisis. This is rates of substance use disorders. R squared of 0.06 is basically nothing. There are people using and abusing drugs in every state in the nation. Okay? And people start to get really irritated when I make this argument. For people who argue fundamentally that this is a drug problem, my response to you is, do you think people use drugs in Chicago? They do. What about West Virginia, the home of the opioid epidemic? Right? Highest overdose death rate in the United States, far lower rates of homelessness than Seattle or San Francisco. If this fundamentally were a drug problem, we should see huge rates of homelessness in West Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas. We don't. It's not to minimize this crisis in any way. The point is that we like to use that as a causal explanation for this crisis when in fact there's something else going on. The other thing that's really important when we talk about a behavioral health crisis is those conditions can be a cause of homelessness. They can also be a response. Homelessness can be the cause of those conditions. The research on this is hard to read. Like, it makes you want to cry. You leave people on the street for 2 years, no shower, no food, no medical care, being victimized physically and sexually at really high rates, and then people develop behavioral health disorders, and we're like, what's going on? It's like, well, no kidding. It's a natural human response to brutal trauma. And so we are, and I say this to elected leaders all over the United States, we are pouring gasoline on this fire by leaving people on the streets. If you don't want someone mentally ill urinating on the street, how about let's get them off the street? Okay? And if we continue to leave people in this condition, we will have a growing behavioral health crisis, which will require more and more dollars to serve these folks. And getting them into housing after 5 years on the street is tough work. Those people who are doing this work know that. People are not ready to just all of a sudden sit down and be like, okay, I'm ready to go, right? They've been incredibly traumatized. Okay, so race. Black, brown, indigenous people are grossly overrepresented in the homeless population. So does race help us understand this regional variation story? And the answer to that question is no. Okay. There's actually no relationship, or in fact a negative relationship, between the share of a population that's black and rates of homelessness. So we know that black people are way overrepresented in the homeless population, yet cities with really high black populations have lower rates of homelessness. Chicago, much higher black population than Seattle. Far lower rates of homelessness. So what does this say? How do I explain this? The way I explain this is that race doesn't cause homelessness. Being black doesn't cause homelessness. What causes homelessness is racism. Racism helps to identify the people in a city who are most likely to experience homelessness. Okay? So discrimination and racism in multiple sectors of society and institutions, criminal justice, education, healthcare, housing, helps to explain why Black, brown, and indigenous people are grossly overrepresented in the homeless population. And that's true in Denver and in Seattle and Jackson, Mississippi, and Boston, and you name it. Okay? So it helps us to understand who is homeless. It doesn't help us understand why Seattle has more homelessness than Chicago, if that makes sense. Okay? So none of these individual attributes or conditions helps us understand the core question that we're trying to answer. So we're still hunting. All right, so what is it about our city that's producing this crisis? This comes up at every single party that I go to in Seattle. Everyone talks about how much their home is worth and how much they hate homelessness. It happens at every single party I go to. It is like the topic. Okay? Gregg, and then unfortunately, people will be like, well, Gregg wrote a book on that. I'm like, please don't say that. And then my wife is like, oh, here we go again. Okay? Gregg, it's warm in LA and it's cold in Chicago. Of course, LA is going to have a lot of homelessness. Well, what about Phoenix and Texas and Florida and places that are really warm and don't have lots of homelessness? And Boston's really not that nice in January. It's terribly cold and has tons of homelessness. Okay? So we'd love to blame Mother Nature. We can't blame Mother Nature. Gregg, if we weren't so generous, people would stop moving here to experience homelessness. Okay? The mobility argument, the magnet theory, is super prevalent. I've heard it almost everywhere I go. And I tell people, I was like, that's not how magnets work. I'm not a physicist, but everyone can't be the destination. Okay? There's tons of anecdotal evidence, but there's very little structural evidence of mobility being the driver of homelessness in a particular city. This is TANF, which is the primary federal welfare program, came into being in '96 under Clinton's welfare reform. There's states that are stingy, some are generous. We can see, do people congregate in states with generous benefits? The answer to that question is no. I support generous benefits, but people are not making locational decisions to move across the country because of slightly more generous benefits. Oh, look at Iowa's TANF benefits. I think I'll move from LA to Iowa. It doesn't happen. Okay? The reason it doesn't happen is moving state to state is hard in the best of circumstances. Low-income mobility is actually really high because folks with lower incomes tend to rent, and leases are 1 year. So what we see is within a city, within a metro area, low-income mobility is far greater than people with higher incomes. As soon as you look at state-to-state mobility, it falls for people with lower incomes. Right? And I use the example of our move to Seattle in 2017. We had 2 middle school kids, every advantage under the sun, and it was a very painful process. We didn't have any friends, had to find a house in Seattle, new jobs, new schools for the kids, and we had every advantage under the sun. Now do that with nothing. Or a family member's the only one who's going to watch your kids when you work in Seattle, and now you're going to move to Wichita, Kansas. People always say to me, why don't they just move, Gregg? I'm like, why should they have to move? This has been their home. We priced them out. Why do they have to leave and go to Kansas? Makes no sense to me. So there's this mobility argument is so prevalent. Margot Kuchel, in her study of California homelessness, found that 90% of the people experiencing homelessness are from California. Okay? So is there an anecdote of someone moving from Indianapolis to LA? Probably so. And is some journalist interviewed that person? Probably. And then everyone then tells me at cocktail parties of this is the story. The other problem is that we sometimes are imprecise when we ask people where they're from. If someone stopped me on the street and said, Gregg, where are you from? I'd say, I'm from Minnesota. I think of myself as a Minnesotan. I've lived in Seattle for 7 years. But then if they asked that question and I was homeless, they'd say, like, there's a guy from Minnesota in Seattle. That's not, the mobility wasn't part of the story. I just moved here, ran into tough times, and I'm now experiencing homelessness. So I think a lot of these reasons why we're tempted to make these arguments is that we can place blame elsewhere as opposed to looking in the mirror. I think that's fundamentally what a lot of these arguments are about. Because if you don't buy these arguments, then it's like, oh crap, this is on all of us. I think that's what's driving this. Democratic mayors? Seattle and San Francisco and LA are run by Democrats. True, they have lots of homelessness. Also true. Therefore, as President Trump argued in his first term, 1 + 1 = 2. Governor Newsom wasn't a big fan of that. Governor of California. Okay. Generally speaking, cities in the United States, big cities, are run by Democrats. If Democrats alone are to blame, why have they not produced a massive homelessness crisis in St. Louis and Denver, or in Chicago and Cleveland? They've been run by Democrats for a long time. This does not mean that Democrats don't share some blame, especially in Western states that have grossly underproduced housing. under the watch of Democratic governors. I've had multiple meetings with Governor Inslee, who just stepped down after 3 terms, governor of Washington, and he has said one of his big regrets, is this housing crisis that really blossomed during the 12 years that he was governor. And he's a Democrat, right? So, but this simple analysis of just a lefty, permissive mayors causing this crisis doesn't really hold up. Doesn't really hold up. Okay, so now to the punchline here. I always joke that no one's giving us a Nobel Prize for this slide, but this is kind of the important slide. Where rents are high, homelessness is high. And these R-squareds, while certainly not causal, are a heck of a lot more convincing than anything else that we test in the book. A related variable is vacancy rates. For those of you who have not studied urban economics, 5% is kind of considered the neutral point for a rental market, kind of the natural rate of vacancy. It's just like the natural rate of unemployment. You can't get to 0. Right, because Andy leaves his job and that seat's going to be empty for a little while, and then eventually someone will fit it. And when you do that across an entire economy, you got 3 or 4% unemployment, natural rate. Same thing with housing, rental housing. So if you have less than a 5% vacancy rate, that actually means you have a deficit of rental housing. You don't have enough rental housing. And what you'll see is when you get below 5%, what happens? Rates of homelessness are a lot higher. When you put those 2 things together, what you'll find is high rents and low vacancies almost perfectly predict high rates of homelessness. Put another way, there's not a counterexample. There's not an expensive place with low vacancies in the United States that doesn't have a problem with homelessness. Okay? So it's not a perfect predictor. We don't have perfect explanations in the social world. But I would argue this is a heck of a lot better than all the nonsense that I'm hearing when I'm drinking a glass of red wine on Saturday night. Okay? So, and this is highly relevant to your context here. I forgot to mention your rates of homelessness here. I'll do that in a moment. You were kind of in the middle of the city pack in 2019, about 5 per capita. You're up to about 8 and change now. So I would kind of put you at the 75th percentile now, maybe 80th percentile in that distribution. So it's a very troubling move for Denver. Not surprising given what's going on in your housing market, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But do we have homelessness in Seattle because of Amazon? The population boom that we experienced with our tech boom was unbelievable. Ours was as pronounced as the Bay Area's, but the Bay Area's was spread out over 20 years. Ours happened in a decade. It was incredibly disruptive. A lot of wealth, a lot of good things, but a lot of bad things. So maybe if you were to poll people who are sympathetic to my argument in Seattle and said, why do we have homelessness? A lot of them would just say, well, Amazon blew up Seattle and became unaffordable. It was a demand issue. And it's certainly part of the story. But what's interesting is when you plot population growth and rates of homelessness over the decade of the 2010s, there's almost no statistical relationship, which really surprised me. I thought I would see more of a relationship there. And what I realized after running this a few times was, 1, it wasn't a mistake, and 2, there are actually a lot of fast-growing places in the United States, and they don't all look like Seattle or Boston or San Francisco. Why is that? Because they had a different relationship with supply. So you probably didn't come for an economics lecture, but you're going to get a little one. Okay? Supply elasticity is a really important concept. The idea of elasticity is when prices change, how much of a good do you produce? If the price of these clickers goes up a whole bunch, what's going to happen? They're going to make a bunch of these. Pretty elastic good. I can make a lot of these pretty quickly if I own this company. Problem with housing is you can't just build more housing. Price of housing can go up 10 times tonight in Denver. You're not going to get more housing in a week. So generally speaking, housing isn't a terribly elastic good. We also know that from city to city, there's big variation in elasticity, driven by 2 factors. Topography, if you have mountains and water, it's harder to build more housing. Your market will be less elastic. Your supply will be less elastic. It's hard to say. And if you have a really strict regulatory environment, you will produce less housing as prices go up. If you combine challenging topography and really strict regulations, you will end up with a really, really inelastic housing supply. San Francisco is the prime example. Beautiful place, mountains, water, and unbelievably strict regulations. It is so hard to build housing. 3 years to get a permit, just the first permit to build housing in San Francisco. And people are dying in the streets. Okay. And I'm not opposed to regulation. I think there's a proper role for regulation in society. I want my ground beef to be safe. I want people to live in safe housing. But there has to be a middle ground between that and not being able to build housing in a city that needs more housing than any other place. Okay. So if you layer a tech boom on top of an inelastic housing supply, what do you get? A disaster. So for Seattle, this is tragic but 100% predictable. Think about this as a proxy for housing demand, change in population, high housing demand, and then this is supply elasticity. Above 1 would mean you have an elastic housing supply. The higher the number, the more housing you build. This upper right-hand quadrant is really interesting, which is the Sun Belt. They grew just as fast as our coastal boom towns, but they built a ton of housing. Why? Because they've very limited regulation and they can sprawl. Okay? That might not be my first choice in terms of how we create more housing capacity, but what it means is if you build the units, you can actually keep a housing market in reasonable shape. These are their vacancy rates during the decade of the 2010s while they were growing incredibly rapidly. Well, how did they do it? They just built a ton of housing. This is the perfect storm for housing and homelessness crisis. A bunch of people move there, inelastic housing, you don't build much housing, and look at these vacancy rates. 3% over a decade on average is a terribly troubling rental market, which is why our rents just did this, which is a problem for all sorts of people, but particularly if you're vulnerable. So what's happened since we published the book? We had a pandemic which disrupted lives and certainly disrupted our data. Basically, the gist is that the logic of the book holds, and unfortunately it holds for more cities. We're now seeing places like Phoenix and Austin and Sacramento and Atlanta and your city that are behaving and looking a lot like coastal cities in terms of housing market dynamics and associated challenges with homelessness. So it's unfortunate, but you are in good company. It's not necessarily a company you want to keep, but you're right there now. 2024 PIT count was very problematic. We are seeing increases across the country. All right, so this is what's been going on in your city. Your MSA has almost identical patterns. I just didn't put up the MSA, the metropolitan area, but it's basically the same story. This rent growth over 10 years is, I do this every city I go to visit. I haven't seen one that's higher. 7.5% year after year after year is a disaster. Rents have doubled in 10 years. Home prices have gone up 140% over 10 years at the median based on US Census. That is just, it's really unbelievable. Your rents, or your vacancy rates have been basically below 5% the entire decade, which is basically just an accelerant on rents. Okay? You just do not have enough housing, your vacancy rates are low, and that just keeps pushing rents higher and higher and higher. Interestingly, your population is up about 10% over the decade, which is pretty good growth. It's not crazy, but it's pretty aggressive. But what's interesting, and this is happening a lot of places, and I'm doing some research on this now, part of the story here is household composition is changing. Households are becoming smaller. So in 2013, rental households averaged 2.2 people in a unit. A decade later, it's now 1.8. So you lost almost half a person in every unit, which basically just means you have more housing demand, even with no population growth. I was just in Albuquerque last week. Albuquerque has not grown in a decade, and their vacancy rates have gone from 8 to 4. Their single-person households have gone up 30,000 households during that time. So they basically have a housing crisis without growth, which is a total bummer. And they're like, well, what do we do about that? I'm like, well, we have to have a conversation about that. Just people, the way people are living is changing. COVID certainly contributed to that, but it makes the problem more challenging. It'd be easier if people were getting married and had roommates, because you can just get more people in a unit, but we're spreading out. Anyway, I don't have an answer to that, but I'm interested in the question of why it's happening, and then we can figure out, but there are all sorts of kind of housing stock questions that we need to be wrestling with in light of these structural household dynamics. So we have this growing problem. What are we going to do? We can either build housing and create a lot more affordable housing, or in the interim, that's going to take a while. Well, why don't we just arrest them? Because I'm sick and tired of seeing these people around my downtown. So the Supreme Court, US Supreme Court last year in June, in the Grants Pass case said, it's now the law of the land where we can criminalize people sleeping outside on public land. Okay. I would argue that if your goal is to reduce homelessness, it is an incredibly counterproductive policy. If people are struggling to maintain a job and maintain housing, how about we find them and give them a criminal record? It's just going to make that harder. So I have real issues with it from just a moral standpoint. I think it's cruel. But even if you set that aside and just say, if our goal is to reduce homelessness, it's wildly counterproductive, and the research is very clear on that. This has not stopped a lot of people from pursuing this, especially at the state level. This came from a journalist in Oklahoma who was interviewing the author, the sponsor of a criminalization bill in the state legislature in Oklahoma. She apparently had read our book and asked this legislator, do you feel like homelessness is a housing problem? He said, well, it could be. I mean, it could be if they don't have any place to live. Okay? So I'll leave that without comment. So housing is at the root of this. All right, so I'm going to wrap up here, and then we can have some time for Q&A. I will frequently hear from people who are persuaded by the argument, but not fully, by saying, Greg, we've already spent all this money, and it hasn't gone away, and in fact, it's gotten worse. Why would we continue to do that? And I think it's a fair question, right? We want to be good stewards of public resources. We want to see good outcomes from the investments that we make. The reason why that question, to me, doesn't make logical sense is that the scale of our investments have been woefully inadequate to the scale of the crisis. So LA passed $1.3 billion, Prop HHH for homelessness. I was at UCLA talking about this. They were complaining that it didn't end homelessness. I said, well, you have a $50 billion problem. You threw $1 billion at it and it didn't go away. Doesn't mean the interventions are bad. Doesn't mean the investments are poor. The counterfactual, you're better off for having done that. But you just have a huge scale mismatch. Right? It's like your doctor giving you a two-week course of antibiotics. You take it for 2 days and you go back and say, antibiotics don't work, I'm still sick. It's like, well, you have the wrong dosage. Right? We do this in homelessness all the time. The second reason why I think those analyses are problematic is most of the money we spend on homelessness is in response to the crisis. And I'm grateful that we do that. It's life-saving. We have a crisis response system, shelters, et cetera, that care for people in their moment of greatest need. And yet we blame that system for ongoing homelessness. It's not their job. Their job is to care for someone who now no longer has housing. We're going to give them a bed and meals and hopefully get them back on their path. We don't blame the ER doc for people breaking arms, yet we blame the crisis response system for ongoing homelessness. Okay. What we need to be doing is blaming the system that is producing all these people that are flowing into the crisis response system. That's how we stop homelessness. If we don't do that and people keep entering the system, we will have to build a larger and larger and more expensive crisis response system, and we will never keep up. This is New York City. This is what they've done for 25 years. Massive shelter system, consumes billions of dollars a year, and they just warehouse folks. Okay. LA's crisis response system gets a lot of flack. They actually do an unbelievable job of getting people housed. Tens of thousands of people getting housed, but at the same time, more people are entering, and so the numbers keep going up, and everyone says they don't know what they're doing. It's totally unfair critique, in my opinion. Okay? The crisis response system is not responsible for the inflow. The issue for the inflow is that we have not made the necessary investments upstream to create the housing that we need to prevent people from experiencing homelessness. We haven't built enough market rate housing, and we sure as hell haven't built enough affordable housing. And we're living with the consequences of that. And Joe on the street is obviously the most obvious victim of that. But then when we start talking about building housing, and I know that you've had these challenges in your community, that's when things get difficult. We're going to change land use. Oh boy, right? We're going to create more density. Ooh, not in my neighborhood. Okay? And so it's easier said than done. In theory, it makes perfect sense. Of course we need more housing, but how are we going to actually do it here and there and here? That becomes difficult. And that's why this problem has become so intractable in a lot of places. Who should do this? I have the enviable position of being accused of being both a shill for corporate interests, because I think that it should be easier for developers to build housing, and I also get accused of being a socialist. Okay? And neither of those are whatever. I don't have an issue with either of them, but it's just funny that I'm accused of the same. Because I think we should build a lot more market rate housing. We desperately need it. And it's too difficult for private developers to build that housing. Will they make money in the process? Yes. That's how capitalism works. And we can have an ideological discussion about, does capitalism in the United States work well? I think there are a lot of critiques of it. But in the interim, we need to figure this out now, yesterday. Joe needs a house tomorrow. And so me sitting in my office pontificating about the evils of capitalism doesn't help Joe tomorrow. So I am a pragmatist in that sense. I also then want to say we're going to build a bunch of market rate housing, and there are going to be people who can't afford that housing. That's not socialism, that's mathematics. Okay? And that's where we have to start thinking about what is the role of the public sector in ensuring that people can afford housing. That's a productive conversation that we should be able to have as adults without throwing around socialism critiques. And there's nothing wrong with socialism. Okay? That's not socialism. That's just government doing things. Right? I went to public high school, not a socialist. It's just a public service. All right, so to wrap up, my hope with this talk is that we take some attention away from Joe on 3rd Avenue, because what it does is if we can blame Joe, it absolves us of responsibility, right? If instead I walk by Joe and say, oh, Joe is a victim of the structures that I, Gregg Colburn, have contributed to, it forces me to look in the mirror and say, well, what am I going to do? That's uncomfortable. And we don't like to do that as a society. It's just a lot easier to blame them. Because then we say, if it is upon all of us, then we have to start talking about what are our structural solutions going to be. And those require political courage and resources and some of these things that are in short supply. Easier to blame Joe. Final thing. We have all sorts of debates, for those of you who have been following this, about the efficacy of these programs that we have to end homelessness. Housing First doesn't work. It's a failure. Look at all the homelessness. The evidence base is overwhelming that Housing First works. The reason why we have a lot of homelessness is we've not extended that intervention sufficiently. It's a scale problem. Where we have scaled it, in the case of veteran homelessness, we've cut homelessness by 55% in a decade, just over a decade. Why do we do it? It's good politics to house veterans. Republicans and Democrats supported investments that went through HUD and the VA to make sure that people got housing and supportive services. And there were plenty of people with severe behavioral health challenges in this population. And what happened? It worked. Okay? And so it amazes me when we continue to hear these arguments of it doesn't work. It's like, we have one success story in the United States. It's veteran homelessness. And what do? We provided housing and services, which is what Housing First is. Okay? The reason we have this problem is we've not extended that logic more broadly. And I'm all for housing veterans. My grandpa's a veteran, my dad's a veteran. Fantastic. Fantastic. But I don't know why we need to draw the line as a society there. But that's what we've done politically. So anyway, thank you so much. I appreciate your attention. I look forward to the conversation, and kind of to reiterate where you are, you have all the markers of kind of the 4-alarm fire. You're not where Seattle is yet, but you're getting darn close. And my fear is that the continued lack of action will produce a city in 10 years that you don't want. And that's certainly where we are in Seattle. And the problem is you get too far down the path and getting out of it is really, really difficult. And so the time to act is yesterday. And so since you didn't act yesterday, today is the best time to do that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Greg. Great talk.
Thank you.
So again, my name is Jonathan Capelli with the Neighborhood Development Collaborative, a coalition of affordable housing providers, as Mark said. Thanks, Mark, for sponsoring, and Andy for hosting. So going to kick it off with, I was supposed to give a little more background on Colorado-specific sort of data, but I think Greg's actually remarkably has a lot of Colorado facts already in his head, because there's a lot of cities you're juggling, so good job on that. But I'll give a few additional ones. I want to note we originally had this time for Gregg to give us, I'm glad he talked about his banking background, because we were just going to ask him for investment advice in this economy, but he declined. So additional things going on in Denver. And actually, it could be great to maybe navigate back to that slide that has the typology. Oh, I have the clicker. For all of us who read the book and wondered where Denver sat, where would you point us out to be at approximately?
I would guess that you are more elastic than our coastal cities, but not as elastic as the Texas cities. So I would have you somewhere in here in your population. I would guess that Denver is kind of in this area. And I think you're kind of moving in this direction. I just keep hearing stories about housing not being approved, and I just think your housing is becoming a little less elastic, and you're continuing to grow. So, you're not down here, but I would guess kind of in that vicinity.
Appreciate that. I'll mark my book with a red dot.
Yeah.
For Denver. As far as how that PIT count sort of pans out here, according to Medicaid, there's about 130,000 people that are experiencing housing instability, about 30,000 that access homelessness services, and then 14,000 that are experiencing homelessness at any given time. So we have a huge dearth in supply. I think that was already spoken to, about 250,000 units. We produce affordable housing at about 3,000 units a year, approximately, if you look at CHAFA numbers. But it's been flat for about a decade, more or less. We have a $340 million right now at the state level, so a lot less. Was it $1 billion in Seattle? Is that what you said?
For the levy?
Yeah, yeah. So, it's difficult to figure out how to increase it. So, additional color to the stats that I shared. So, 3 quick questions, and we'll turn over to you guys. I think we have a solid half hour. So, first question that I have is, a big part of policy, I think Raman Kanish is in the room. Yes, former city council person. Maybe 1/10 of policy is a good idea, and then 9/10 is persuading people, right? So what sort of lessons do you have? And I think some policymakers are starting to get the supply argument, but people consistently are sort of voting against these things and it's not jiving. So what are the best and worst practices from a policy and a politics perspective from sort of our similar cohort cities that you've seen that you think we should apply here in and around Denver?
Well, I will say the most effective path to getting the public support on this is crisis. So we are now doing what we should have been doing for a long time in Seattle because it's gotten so bad. That is not a rousing endorsement for public engagement and policymaking. And it's not just Seattle. If you look at the history of the United States, our major policy advances happen during wars, depressions, or pandemics. Okay? Crisis creates the opportunity for this. The reason Seattle's acting now versus 10 years ago is the pain point has gotten so great that now we have to. Okay? So the real question to me is, what are the examples of people who got out in front of this? Who showed leadership and had the political courage and marshaled public will to do things in advance of it being so painful. And frankly, there aren't a ton of those examples. That's part of what I do on my travels is just say, like, I'm the ghost of Christmas to come from a Dickens novel. Right? Don't repeat our mistakes. And I've actually been pleased. Louisville, Kentucky, the state of Kentucky, Indianapolis, having conversations that Seattle should have been having 15 years ago. And I've been back to each of those places 3 times to talk about this. I'm more of a cheerleader than a researcher at this point. And so I do think some folks are starting to wake up. You're beyond where those places are now, right? You don't have the luxury of 5 or 10 years ago, which is when you would have looked a little bit more like them. So I think it's really clarifying that. I would say that the NIMBYism still exists in Seattle, but the fights about upzoning are nowhere near what they were before. People are kind of like, yeah, we need more housing. And so you can wait. You'll get there, but you'll get there for the wrong reasons. And so I do think, there are certain places, my hometown of Minneapolis, upzoned the entire city, and they did it before it was a crisis. And how did they do that? They built grassroots support around the idea that this does not need to be a zero-sum game. Upzoning doesn't mean that I, as a single-family homeowner in a white neighborhood in South Minneapolis, loses. Right? There was actually a white single-family homeowner, wealthy, South Minneapolis. This is where people were opposing upzoning, and she created an organization called Neighbors for More Neighbors. And just flipped the script on this. It's like, oh, more neighbors can be a good thing. It doesn't mean that my quality of life is going to deteriorate. Right? Greater diversity and more folks in the neighborhood brings amenities and different perspectives, and that's a good thing. Why should we, as the privileged few who have single-family homes in Minneapolis, be fighting this? And it really kind of changed the narrative. Obviously, it's a pretty left-leaning place, and they had a city council that was amenable to it. But I do think that some of this kind of framing these issues is really important. And I could go on and on and on, but I won't. But
thank you.
Anyway, a few thoughts.
Next question I had has to do with your the supply or the private versus public sector. I think you said 3 approaches in your earlier slide to addressing these issues. So right now there's a pretty spirited debate in the housing world in Colorado anyway, probably in other places as well, between the role of sort of unleashing the market and to alleviate this, and then the role of subsidized, like directly affordable housing. So you have market adherents think that any restriction on whether it's land use or on affordability is going to have a dampening effect on the massive amount of supply we need to address these issues. And you see that policy kind of carried out in terms of how I think our current governor and others around the state have been thinking about how to solve the crisis through just an influx of supply. Then you have affordable housing sort of sector advocates, et cetera, who feel that if you just unleash the market, you're going to precipitate and accelerate gentrification and displacement. And they think that it needs to be as affordable as possible. They're more likely to be supportive of inclusionary housing, et cetera. So you had that slide about the tensions. How do you balance that? What do you think the right approach is when it comes to balancing the market and directed affordable housing? And do you have displacement concerns for liberalizing zoning?
So there's a lot there.
Yes. Short question, I said.
My brief answer to that would be I don't view them as mutually exclusive. Okay, we can do multiple things at one time. And so I do think that there's a role for liberalizing policies to ensure that people can build more housing more quickly and more cheaply. Okay, that requires political capital, but not financial capital. Right, that's pulling a policy lever. And that can, to a certain extent, unleash. I don't know that I'm a huge fan of the word unleash, but people will use that argument. That should make it easier to build more housing. Land use, regulatory, the whole 9 yards. That alone is insufficient. We need it. Without that, it's going to be really hard to fix all these problems. So I think it's a necessary but insufficient condition. And then we need to have the adult conversation of then how are we going to deal with all the folks who can't afford that housing? And that's where we start to think about the use of public resources or nonprofit resources to ensure that there's greater affordability. And that can come in the form of subsidies, development subsidies from the federal government or local government. It can come in the form of rental assistance. It can come in the form of regulations in terms of inclusionary zoning or rental regulations. And those are all good conversations to have. And we're fighting about rent stabilization in Washington right now, and it's one of the most vicious fights possible. And people keep calling me, the Seattle Times keeps calling me, and I said, I'm not going to say anything. The point is it's complicated. What I've said to the mayor in Seattle when we have our multifamily tax exemption program, which is basically a tax abatement, property tax abatement for developers if they have a certain percentage of their units that are affordable. And they said, well, is this the right way to structure the problem or the program? And I say, you tell me what your goal is and I'll tell you if it's the right way to structure it. If your goal is the most units possible, then we dial it this way. If your goal is more restricted rent units, then we dial it this way. And you know that there's consequences on both sides of that. Same thing with rent stabilization. You want lower rent growth for existing units? Yep, let's have a really strict rent stabilization program like St. Paul, Minnesota, 3%. Was there a supply impact? Yes, there was. Okay. Washington is about to pass a 10% plus CPI rent stabilization bill with vacancy decontrol. Whoop-de-doo. Okay, you can drive a truck through that bill. Okay, so I don't view any of these as either evil or wonderful. It's just a question of trade-offs and how do we put all that together. To me, the big thing is we have to get the people who are involved in the same room as opposed to fighting with each other in the Seattle Times or the Denver Post.
That's
right. That's not productive. That's not productive. I've been at the Office of Housing in Seattle many, many times and kind of educate. I'm not a developer, but just saying like, this is how housing gets developed. Like you need to understand that. And developers, you need to understand that the Office of Housing has a duty to the public. If we're going to waive your taxes, we need to deliver some public benefit. You need to understand that, right? And so those are productive conversations. And so I try to avoid answering like, what's the one thing we should do? Because there isn't one thing. We should do all of that. And is there a role for IZ? Sure there is. It should just be structured appropriately. I'm a big fan of carrots. What kind of carrots can we create to get people to build the housing that we need? Whether that's tax abatements, whether that's 1% financing, whatever the case may be. Density bonuses, you name it. Let's get all the carrots we can. Because some of these, the sticks have not proven to be terribly effective. And when we need both affordability and units, I'm really sensitive to those trade-offs. So that's basically a non-answer, but saying like, I think we just have to have those conversations. And unfortunately, at times it feels a little bit like the abortion debate where we just can't even discuss it. And it's like, no, we should be able to discuss rent regulation, right? I want affordable rents. I care deeply about this. But I also can acknowledge, like, if we have a 2% rent stabilization bill, we're going to lose supply. We just are. And so, and we should be able to have that conversation without someone calling me a shill for corporate interests or a socialist on the other side.
Appreciate that. Hopefully no one in this audience does that, I think.
And last thing I would say is, I think we also have to give our elected leaders a lot more cover. We have not given them the political cover that they need to have these difficult conversations. It is a really unenviable position to be in. And I think that's something that we all can do as people who have the luxury of not being elected leaders, can stand up and say like, no, like they're trying. This might not be my favorite manifestation of this policy, but they're doing something. And it can't be if you do something that I don't like that you're gone in 4 years. Like that's just not a great way to build. No, if they're bad, they should go. But the point is like, we can't just give people 4 years and then they take an unpopular position and they're gone. That's just not a great way to build long-term viability in policymaking around these really tough issues. Sorry for the amendment.
No, makes sense. Let's see. Well, I'm sure there's questions in the audience. I'm going to ask one last question that I think that you didn't. Well, you sort of got to touch out towards the end, but I think it's important. While I'm doing that, maybe folks who have questions can raise their hands, and we have, I think, 3 mics, and we can start to pass them out. So it looks like Sarah's first. And yeah, if you have one, raise your hand, and someone in the back will get you a mic. Last question from me is, at the very end of your book, you had a really interesting section, I thought, that focused on what you were talking about at the end with how we were able to sort of summon the political will to but make significant strides within veteran homelessness. Mm-hmm. You guys sampled a typology that I thought was really, really interesting for gradating political power and likelihood to achieve a given end to help your, towards your interests, depending on what category you're in. You had an advantaged group, a contender group, a dependent group, and then a deviant group. And depending on how you fall in those categories, you're going to have, again, this political will. I'll let you explain those categories and then maybe help us figure out how to sort of use that typology well to best advance housing for people experiencing homelessness.
So the typology is called the social construction of target populations. There's these books called Theories of the Policymaking Progress that I read when I was getting my PhD. Schneider and Ingram are the authors, I think, if I remember correctly. And the idea of the social construction is that you have a 2x2 matrix, and I think it's deservingness and power. And so like the CEO of Exxon would be high power but low deservingness. And then on the opposite end, you would have widows and orphans who have low power but high deservingness. And so if you look at the history of social policy, that deserving category has received, those folks have gotten a lot of goodies from the federal government and state government. And the people who've gotten the least, the powerful have gotten home mortgage interest tax deductions, right? So we also get goodies, those of us who are in that privileged category. And then the deviants are the folks with no power and very negative social construction. And that is people experiencing homelessness who aren't veterans. The reason veterans get it is because they are deemed deserving and have a positive social construction in the United States, right? Why should someone who defended the country be homeless? Of course, no one would make that argument. And so we have not done a very good job of figuring out how to get people in that deviant category support through the policymaking process. What's interesting, though, is during times of crisis, this happened during the great financial crisis, where all of a sudden people were losing their housing, and what happened? The federal government acted. As soon as the middle class is impacted, then we start to do stuff, right? COVID affected the middle class, and so what happened? We gave people money, right? If it was only poor people who were affected by COVID, we wouldn't have done anything. As a I'm not pleased to say that, but I believe it. So what we have to figure out is then ultimately how do we then put a different face on this? And when we start to see greater homelessness, it is a tragedy, but the one thing that is a benefit is when I talk to a room full of 500 people, the number of people come up and say, my uncle's homeless, my cousin's homeless. It's affecting more and more people, which then starts to move us off of deviancy into, oh, well, this could be me. This could be someone that I love or care about. And that then allows for a broader policy conversation. So I don't have any suggestion. There's all sorts of great scholarship around this on how to move that. But I do think it's an advantage that we have to take. We have to take advantage of this circumstance of it affecting more people, because then we can translate that into policy making. The other thing that I would say on housing and homelessness, and this is how it differs from climate change, for example, huge social problem. The problem with climate change is we have an apathy problem, which is like, I think it's a problem, but I don't know what to do. Should I buy a different car? Should I recycle? It seems woefully inadequate, so it feels like spitting into the ocean. We don't have an apathy problem with housing. People are pissed off. They're engaged morally, they're either pissed off, whatever, and so we've actually cleared that hurdle, which is good, and then we can actually start talking about what we're gonna do. We don't have to build that kind of movement, which is what climate activists have been doing for 30 years. Like, no, this is a really big problem, and everyone's like, well, I gotta take my kids to soccer, whatever. We're there on housing, which is an advantage, so we need to activate that passion.
Appreciate that. Yeah, that's why the environmental movement had to rely on polar bears, right? Like
Yeah.
something you can identify with that's
Right.
cute and cuddly.
Right.
But let's turn it to you guys. So I think Sarah had her hand first, and we'll just go from there.
I appreciate a comment you made earlier. We all want to create those production folks making the housing, and I think the city's making the regulation that permit construction starts. We all want safe, decent, accessible housing. Have you seen examples, and I appreciate that everyone has different conditions,
Right.
but I'm wondering about examples of where complexity, because I don't have the data, but the experience says we are an extremely complex regulatory environment to even start building. Any scenarios in which you could say, okay, they changed this regulation or this permitting requirement, and it really opened something up? And I'll just mention two conversations that have been going on in this area over the last couple of years. One, single stair, and then two, there's a conversation, as I understand it, I'm outside of it, so folks in the room might have more detail, but related to the cost of stormwater filtering systems. And I want to be careful because we don't want to create an environment in which suddenly we're building perceived unsafe or unhygienic housing, but there's got to be that place where choices have unlocked opportunity.
Yep. So I think I've heard examples of the two that you highlighted. I think generally, Minneapolis is an interesting case study because they upzoned, and they got basically no impact right away. And the scholarship suggests that there are all these other things that you have to do in tandem, that just the upzoning itself. So they didn't change height limits. Well, okay, well that doesn't help me. How am I going to build 4 units if I can't go up any higher? They did. Setbacks were the same. And then frankly, the one that, at least in the latest scholarship that I've read, the biggest impact in Minneapolis on housing supply was a change in parking. More than the land use, which is pretty interesting. And so I always say to folks, like, the parking conversation needs to be part of this. And I know that if you're an elected leader, people are already mad at you, and then you're going to start talking about parking, and now they're really mad at me. But it is a really big, so there are design elements, there's design review elements. I'm a big fan of buy right. Let's agree on some models that work for us, and away we go. And I'm not a designer, and so the aesthetic is important to me, but to me, getting the housing built is more important. And so I have design colleagues in architecture who would probably be like, Greg, how can you say that? And it's like, well, I would trade. Doesn't mean that by right we have to have crappy designs. We can have good designs, but we just don't have to start from scratch every time. And this design review is, in my opinion, absurd, right? Why should I be opining on the color of the paint next? I understand why, but in a crisis like this, yeah, right. So anyway, those are some ideas. But I think the point is that there's not one lever that kind of work in tandem. And I think the Minneapolis case shows, like, we need to be thoughtful when we make one of these changes and make sure that the other stuff is complements those decisions as opposed to continues to counteract or frustrates those efforts.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, I see Robin Kanish, and then, yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Thanks. Robin Kanich, recovering elected official. Now
Thank
at
you.
CU Denver teaching these things, and I want to thank
Great.
you. I've taught your article to my graduate students, and I will just share that in our version of the musical chairs game, we adapt even further than your model, which is that I price the chairs.
Right.
And so we might have 12 chairs, but based on the income I assign to students, they may not have access to the chair. And when I write on this, I haven't done a book, just have a Substack, but I write about the fact that it's not just getting folks in the same room. We actually don't have champions of both. And I'm, also a communist sellout, so we can join, we can have a club.
Right.
But I'm trying to occupy some of that space, and I think that it matters a lot that the champions of supply tend to be big capital, and they tend to have a lot of access to the elected officials at the state level. And so beyond places like Oregon, and Lisa Bender is a good friend of mine in Minneapolis, so I know a lot about their story. Those are two rare examples of it being kind of bottom up,
Yep.
racial equity joined with supply.
Yep.
And here in Colorado and many of the other places having this fight, that is not the case. It is very much led by predominantly white, predominantly business oriented. And so I guess, this is maybe more of a comment than a question, but I'm curious what you or the room think. But this idea that you actually have to champion both. You have to you can't just say we need everything, but we need those who are leading the charge for zoning reform to not be opposing every one of the equity strategies, because the marginal benefit of supply, it's real. And I teach my students this. My faculty in my department ate me alive when I taught how the move chain research is showing how it actually works.
Yep.
But the marginal difference of even a 3% benefit on rent is nowhere near bringing it down to the 60% of our community that is earning less than $60,000. And so if you have, it's not just like in the same room, they're literally fighting the equity proposals. And I don't know if in your tours you are seeing that space becoming more, and we're not investing, for example, in the movement building to talk with communities of color about why, now that they've finally gotten into home ownership, we should have multifamily on their block. So it's not just white opponents to this. It's actually working class communities of color. And so I'm just curious about, if you're in rooms with investors, if you're in rooms with people who do the politics of this, and about how to seed that space of this being a more integrated movement. And so just beyond the tactics of the policies, which are really important, but I spend a lot of time thinking about that political space and how to seed and grow that. And I'm just curious if you've seen or have thoughts.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I don't necessarily have great answers for you, but I think those are all fair observations and critiques. My observation is, and we might have a slightly different perspective on this, is I think a lot of people are fighting those things because they don't understand them. And so I do think there's still an issue of, if we actually got people in the room and explain why these are important, right? In Seattle, the Central District was the home of the black population. The Central District gentrified, and there was massive displacement. And now if you look at a map of the black population in Seattle, the Central District was probably 60, 70% black in 1980, and it's now like 15%. And South King County is where is now the home of the black population. And that happened because of economic displacement. And so when people of color in South King County say, why do we then now have to take all the multifamily housing? We already got kicked out of the neighborhood that was our home for generations. That's a fair critique. On the other side, when we hear from lots of people saying, well, I don't want the displacement, so let's not build the housing, I'll say, but the displacement's coming. If we don't build the housing, what's going to happen? Rents are going to go up, and then we're going to have more displacement. And so my response to this is, one, we need to be thoughtful when we're building housing. We have to build housing, and we also need to be thoughtful about the impacts on the people in those neighborhoods. And we can do that. The problem in Seattle is we built a fair amount of housing, but we had zero planning for that. And then there were huge consequences, displacement and gentrification consequences. Can we eliminate all of it as we grow? Probably not. I think we just have to be honest with that, but we can do a heck of a lot better job than we've done over the last 20 years, which was basically just like a free-for-all, and then we saw the consequences. I would say that communities that have experienced sustained disadvantage over time, when they justifiably stand up and say, we're done with this, I don't want housing, I would say that that's probably the most challenging conversation that I have. Because I need to honor that perspective. I totally get it. And when we zoom out to the whole city, it deeply concerns me if we don't build housing. I don't know how to thread that needle, because telling folks who've experienced this oppression for generations, saying, well, you need this. It's like, well, you're like, what are you talking about? So I wish I had a better answer for you. And I don't think we figured this out. But I do think the kind of head in the sand of if we just don't do anything, these problems will go away. That's just not going to work, because Denver's still going to grow and Seattle's still going to grow. But I think I feel better about this now than I did 10 or 15 years ago, because people are at least having this conversation. And I have said in many rooms, like, I assume good intent on all sides until people give me evidence to the contrary. And I think a lot of the distrust is because of lack of understanding. Because I think when I've seen people explain the dynamic, the racial dynamic in Seattle to developers, and they're like, oh, I get that. I can understand why people are frustrated. And so therefore, now that I understand that, now let's talk about it. We might not agree, but at least there's some sense of understanding. And I just don't think the understanding is there for a lot of folks. And Office of Housing, I was literally educating them on how housing gets built. They're good people. They're very equity focused. And I was like, there's not margin just laying out there that that if you cut that the housing is still going to get built. It's just not going to get built. And so anyway, I just think we have to build those bridges. It's not going to solve the issues, but at least we have a chance to have a productive conversation.
Thank you. Let's get at least one more, maybe two for quick. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I have just a couple points. As a recent transplant from Chicago, places like Cabrini Green, Henry Horner Homes were built and were very well-intentioned. It was public housing, and knowing someone who lived in Cabrini Green early on, it was an okay place to live. Mm-hmm. Do you ever hear the argument, when we increase this housing, how are we going to keep the density issues from generating in crime, et cetera?
Yep.
Another point is, in Denver, I hear repeatedly, wow, when I lived here, it was wide open spaces, and now it's getting too crowded. So I'm almost picking up that there's a cultural issue that would be hard to break through about, we want the wide open spaces again. And then just third point, I don't know if you saw the New York Times Magazine yesterday. New York Times Magazine completely was about this issue. Their answer is building more tract housing. And of course, they're doing it in places like Texas. But, you said that you were that wasn't your answer. I'm afraid that when the New York Times is putting this forward, it's kind of going against what you had said, and there's more need to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. So the Sprawl article was written by Connor Doherty, who I know and I respect Connor. I disagreed with him in the article. I think there are better ways to create the housing, but that's a long conversation. But I think it's fair to at least have the conversation. I think the point of more units helps. Okay, well then, how do we design that? We can do this or we can do that. That's fine. Let's have that conversation. At least we're talking about more housing. To me, that's a win that the New York Times is writing that article. And what's interesting is Connor got beat up big time for that article. I mean, people were after him, like, what are you doing? To me, that's a productive thing. Like, he's a big boy. He can handle it. He writes for the New York Times. But at least people are now having the discussion of, yeah, we need housing, but that's not the way we want to do it. Fantastic. Let's talk about that. To your first point, I love talking about housing history in Chicago. I coached Little League Baseball in Cabrini Green. Aaron also worked at Cabrini Green. You did as well? Awesome. And so, driving around Denver the last 2 days, density is not going to be your problem, right? Aaron took me by some public housing that's still standing. It's not even in the ballpark of Cabrini Green. So my advisor at the University of Minnesota, Ed Getz, has written on public housing. He has a great book called New Deal Ruins. Ed makes the argument that we had a couple high-profile disasters in public housing, Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, Cabrini Green, Robert Taylor homes, et cetera, in Chicago, which were less than ideal. Ed was getting his PhD at Northwestern as they were starting to tear down Cabrini Green, and it was called the Gates of Hell. And his research question was, if this is the gates of hell, why are these residents protesting tearing down the towers? If you're getting me out of hell, I should be celebrating. Instead, they're saying this is my home. So there's more to this. His book argues that public housing for some high-profile disasters worked pretty darn well. And there's still public housing in your city, in my city, in New York City, that's still we've underfunded it grossly, and it's still operating, right? We have taken a few big issues and painted the entire thing with a negative brush. And so when people say, well, Greg, you want more density, I'm scared of Cabrini Green, let's talk about how Cabrini Green got created. The federal government said you can spend X dollars per square foot, which is basically what it costs to build a prison. And you have to go up, and all the aldermen in Chicago, the white aldermen said, they're not going in my neighborhood, and so where did it go? Okay? And so then what we did over time is it went from low middle income white households living in public housing in Chicago and in Boston to disproportionately black households of the lowest income. Right? When we concentrated this poverty and this race in these areas, we ended up with crime and drug problems, and everyone said this is the full problem. So then we tear them down, we do Hope 6, we do less units, and then what happens is the boys that I was coaching were getting spread all over the city, right? I was there in 97 and 98 and 99. We had 6 years old to 13 on one baseball team because these boys were being spread out to public housing projects all over, which if you've ever seen the development of young boys, that's not a good age span, okay? But the point is like there wasn't going to be sufficient housing in the near north because we tore them down. So point one, public housing was not the failure that we thought it was. Point two, I don't think we're going to replicate Cabrini and Pruitt-Igoe, and I'm fine with that. And three, you are so far away from that in Seattle and Denver that we don't need to worry about that. We can build more density without creating the gates of hell 2.0 would be my argument. Thus endeth my Chicago housing history rant.
Yeah. Well, really appreciate it, Freda. I think we're actually good on questions. So yeah, thanks again. I know, Andy, you're coming up next. I think your book made a really big impact in the housing world. It was new, it was fresh, and it was really nuanced, which is why we've been able to have such an interesting, good conversation. So appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
And Andy.
You know, if you go into a conference with 300 people and you say, 300 housing people, and you say, how many people got training to work in this field? 2 of them will raise their hand. Literally, and this was last week at a conference. So the ways you get into the affordable housing field are you stumble across a job, or you answer a job ad, or you get interested in affordable housing and you stalk the local housing authority and you get an internship, and they take a chance on you and you take a chance on them. So it's a tremendously difficult field to get into with a level of experience. And when Mark hires people like that and takes a chance on them, he spends a year training them at lost productivity, not only for himself, but for the person. So that costs what, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 of lost productivity. MSU Denver is great. MSU Denver is all about outcomes. We have an affordable housing undergrad program that trains people to go into the field. We have non-credit courses to teach people from the community and upskill people in the industry about affordable housing. I may have missed this, Gregg or Jonathan. My apologies if I did. Gregg talked about something called a point-in-time survey. So I'm going to rain on my own parade with numbers. So the point-in-time survey is once a year. This is from last year, 2024. It's a count of homeless people. So it undercounts homeless people because it's the people they can find, and different jurisdictions do their count different ways. Some put volunteers and city employees on the street to count people. Some jurisdictions ask homeless people to come to some central point to be counted. So it's a really inconsistently held metric, and yet it's the metric we have. So this goes from Boulder County in the north to Douglas County. In the metro area, in that 5-county region, last year there were 9,977 homeless folks. In the city of Denver, Denver City and County, there were 6,539. Some of those are kids that are unaccompanied. So it's a huge problem. Really, in higher ed, do we help solve the problem? I think by creating a workforce that's trained, we help with that. But really, I think the conversations that Gregg brings up, and Jonathan and Mark, you in sponsoring this, goes a long way to bringing this to light. So thank you guys on behalf of MSU Denver for coming today, and Jonathan, Gregg, and Mark. Thank you for the conversation today. Mark.
Just one last quick round of thank yous. So once again for Gregg, thank you for coming to Denver and sharing your research and your thought-provoking and very actionable kind of book you've written that we all need to consider as we're going to the ballot box, as we're attending city council meetings here and planning meetings. So thank you all. Thanks to our staff. Thanks to our partners, Urban Land Conservancy, our other sponsors here, Columbia Ventures, Denver Foundation, CHAFA. We really appreciate you coming out here and making this a successful evening, afternoon for us here. And we look forward to keeping the conversation going. So thanks again. Thank you.